Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's 12 o'clock. I guess we'll get going. As you are all familiar, my name is Katie Makahonyuk. I'm the Plant Health Officer for Division 1, which is Southeast Saskatchewan. This is our fourth webinar in our Weed Inspector 101 series, and today we're going to talk about Weed ID. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. As always, the line is muted for the duration of the presentation. If you have any questions, just feel free to type them into the question box and we'll get to them as we can. The webinar will be recorded, and a lot of you have been asking, and yes, this webinar is available for 1 credit for those of you who have your licensed pesticide applicator or your pesticide applicator license. So we are going to have Clark Brenzel present. He is the Provincial Weed Control Specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture. Most of you are all familiar with him as well, so he's got some good info for us today, and we will let him present.
Okay, hopefully everybody can see the presentation there. How are we doing there, Katie? Okay?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, good. Okay, so essentially what we're going to do today is do a 100-mile-an-hour identification basics of a good group of prohibited weeds, particularly the ones that we do have here in the province, and then some select noxious weeds. We're not really going to get into the annual crop noxious weeds because they overlap a lot with most of our common weeds, and most folks that are out there to help you out in the countryside can identify them fairly easily. What we're going to do is kind of focus on some of the ones that are more specific to undisturbed lands, and work from that perspective. So we'll start out with prohibited weeds, and the first one we'll talk about is spotted knapweed. Spotted knapweed is it's kind of an odd plant the way it works. It's a taproot perennial plant. It doesn't have any creeping roots to it. The taproot can go down 10, 12, 15 feet, something like that, to be able to access moisture deep in the soil. It starts out as a rosette, and it's a bit of an odd plant in that it kind of acts like a multiple biennial, where it can stay as a rosette for 2 or 3 years until it accumulates enough energy in the root, and then what it'll do is bolt and produce top growth for a few years as well, and then it'll die back eventually. So it's a perennial that will last maybe up to 8-ish years. So it's kind of an odd life cycle in that perspective. Stems are very strongly branched, up to 1 meter tall, and you've got flowers at the end of each one of those branches. The branches themselves have fine hairs on them, and it gives the whole plant has fine hairs on it, and gives it a bit of an appearance of like a ghostly gray color when you see it from a distance. The rosette leaves are twice divided, and essentially what that means is that you'll have a central vein of the leaf. They're almost compound leaves, not quite. There'll be a little bit of leaf material right along the edge of the vein, but it looks like a compound leaf, but it's actually not. A compound leaf is a leaf that has a central stem, and then it'll have little leaflets that come off the side. But these ones here are not compound leaves. They're just very deeply divided into lobes. And so when we say twice divided, that means that those lobes are also divided into lobes. So you have kind of a you've got all these leaves overlapping, you've got a bit of a netted appearance to the leaves. As you get closer to the top of the plant, and in younger seedlings, before the rosette really gets well developed, you have fewer divisions or lobes in those leaves, and they get much smaller as they head towards the top of the plant. So they're much reduced as you get up there. Flowers are are thistle-like flowers, so they are a bud with they're in the sunflower family. So essentially what you have is a platform where you've got a bunch of tubular flowers in the middle, and then you've got a bunch of what they refer to as ray flowers on the outside. And so that bottom right hand photo that you can see there, in the inside you can see the lighter colored tube flowers, and then on the outside you can see those ray flowers that kind of spread out and create that that broader flower structure. These flowers run anywhere from a magenta color, which is kind of a purpley red color, all the way to a deep purple. Sometimes you get white flowers as well, and those are just little variants that are in the different biotypes that are out there. Buds are typically egg-shaped and about, anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch broad. On those buds, you have bracts or modified leaves, and those bracts create a scale-like appearance on the side of the bud, and that those scales have black tips and fringes on the top sides of those bracts, and that gives it the bud a bit of a spotted or netted appearance. Diffuse snapweed is very similar to spotted knapweed in appearance. There are a few sort of variants to it. It's typically a biennial, but it can also be an annual or short-lived perennial. So from that perspective, it's much shorter lived than each individual plant is shorter lived than spotted knapweed. Generally, what you're looking at is something that germinates 1 year, it flowers the next year, and then dies. And so that's the biennial life cycle. Short-lived perennial will see it maybe flower again another year after that before the individual plant dies. It has a very deep taproot to be able to access moisture, very similar to spotted knapweed. Leaves are similarly twice divided as spotted knapweed, but the lobes are much smaller and finer. The divisions are in between those lobes are much shorter as well. So overall, it's just a finer plant, and it also has that kind of grayish appearance to the foliage as well. The flowers are typically white, but they can also be pink, and sometimes those pink flowers can also be hybrids with spotted knapweed. So it's a bit of an odd situation. You've got two species that can hybridize and create a viable plant as well. They're very similar in size and shape to like the buds themselves to spotted knapweed. The difference, however, is that on the tips of those scales or bracts that we talked about for spotted knapweed, diffuse snapweed has a series of spines. There's one terminal spine, and it has a few branches on it, and then it also has some spines coming off the sides of the bract itself. If it's been hybridized with spotted knapweed, sometimes those spines are black as well. And we talked about the hybrids before that. Another member of the knapweed family is yellow star thistle, and that's one that we don't have any record of in the province at this point, but there are populations. There's 30,000 acres on the lake that's south of Minot, around the dam site there at the lake between Bismarck and Minot in North Dakota, and there are several sites in Montana. So it's not unheard of that we would see this plant arrive on our shores here fairly shortly. It's a winter annual, so essentially it grows as a rosette in the fall, and then overwinters as a rosette, and then bolts and flowers and dies after producing seed. The stem can be up to 2 meters tall, so that's upwards of 6 feet. Leaves, they start as being fused to the stem, and that's that top left picture that you can see there. And it creates a winged appearance on the stem. And then as that continues along the stem, you'll see the leaf separate from the stem and create leaves that stick out from that stem. They tend not to be overly divided. They're fairly small once they depart from the stem. And essentially, rosette leaves are deeply divided. They've got those hairs on them, and they're fairly similar to, they almost look like a Canada thistle rosette without spines on it, essentially. As I said, the entire plant is covered with cottony hair, and it gives it a gray, ghostly gray appearance. The flowers are, again, similar in shape and size to the other two knapweeds that we talked about. The distinction in this case is that at the end of those bud scales, we've got a very long, stiff spine that occurs there with two lateral spines that are at the base of it. This makes it very hard for animals to graze where these plants exist without injury. Again, we talked about that. The other key thing is that it's an unusual from the perspective that the flower is yellow as well. And one of these plants can produce up to 100,000 seeds, and the seeds come in a few different types. There are one type that can germinate immediately, and then there's another type that can lay dormant for many, many years and allow that population to persist over time with fairly intensive control measures taking place. Field Scabies is another plant that we have here in the province. It's originally from Europe, and it's got a strong taproot to it. It's a member of the Thistle family, and what we may find is that as we do revisions to the Weed Control Act weed list, we may introduce another Thistle to that list that is kind of running rampant in Minnesota right now. So we'll evaluate that and put that on the list if need be. It likes damp sites, higher organic matter sites and damp sites. We've got some in Birch Hills and south of Yorkton, and there's another population, the White Beach pasture in the far northeast. The entire plant is covered with a very coarse, stiff hair. So if you touch the foliage, you can feel those hairs are very distinctive on that all the surfaces of the plant. They can, if they get embedded in your skin, they can cause some itching as well. Growth begins with a fairly large rosette, and that's that bottom picture there. That rosette in that picture is about 1 foot or to 1.5 foot across the rosette in diameter. So it is a fairly large rosette, and you can see the leaves on that rosette are quite deeply divided with a fairly significant terminal lobe on that leaf. Stems can grow anywhere from 1 to 4 feet tall. Generally, the ones that you're going to see out there are in that 4-foot range. They're fairly conspicuous once you see them. The real key thing for identification here is that you can have a distance of almost 1 foot between the nodes, and the nodes are where the leaves actually grow out from the stem. So you can have a big long stretch of bare stem, then you'll have a pair of leaves, and then you'll have another big long stretch of bare stem, and it continues on that way. So that's a really distinctive characteristic of field scabies. It can have several stems that come from one crown, and the crown is at the base of that rosette there. Stems are typically unbranched until you get up into the flowering stage of the plant, where you'll have one set of kind of minimalized leaves, and then it'll branch off into the flowering structure. Leaves are opposite on the stem, so you'll have basically two kinds of arrangements of leaves on the stem. One is opposite, like the ones you see here, where they're directly across from one another on the stem. The other is alternate. So you'll see things going stepwise up the stem is the alternate pattern. But these plants have opposite leaves. And again, they have that great large distance between the nodes. The ones at the bottom of the plant are very deeply lobed. And then the topmost ones are feather shaped, and they're less coarsely lobed, and they're reduced in size. And so leaves on these plants run anywhere from 10 inches long to 4 inches long as you get towards the top of the plant. The flowers, they're kind of a disc type flower, but they're not a member of the sunflower family, like other plants that we see with these kinds of flower appearances. They start out as a fairly vivid pink color, and then they transition off into a pale blue or purple color. And occasionally they're white. It essentially creates a dome of let's see here. Creates a dome of seeds, coarse seeds when it's mature, and these seeds shatter very easily even when they're still immature. So it's very difficult to collect seeds for the creation of additional plants. Generally, these plants can produce about 2,000 seeds per plant. So on the overall scale of many weeds, it's not very much, but because they tend to grow in fairly dense canopies, they can produce a lot of seed per unit area. A couple of shrubs or trees in the mix here. This common or European Barbary. It's a shrub or small tree that's up to 10 feet tall. The bark is gray and it has sharp spines on it, and generally there are double or triple node or triple spined nodes there. The inner wood is yellow, which is quite distinct, so that's something to use as an identification feature. The leaves are small, toothed, oval shaped, alternate on the stem. They're generally a dull green color. They're not very vibrant, and they're borne in clusters on the branches. Flowers, they're about 1/2 inch long. They're in drooping clumps essentially on the stem, and they have a really unpleasant odor. I haven't had the pleasure, but apparently it's not great. The fruit are a scarlet red to purple color, oblong berries, and contain 1 to 3 small black seeds. So they're fairly attractive to birds, and that's how they would get around. We tend not to see much of this plant because it is an alternate host for stem rust, and there was a very aggressive eradication effort that took place in the 30s on the prairies to get rid of any of these plants because of that problem with being a secondary host for rust of wheat. The other woody plant that we'll talk about here is common or European buckthorn. Different than Barbary. It's a shrub or small tree. It can grow up to 22 feet tall, and the trunk can get up to 10 inches wide. The stems are, the bark is gray to brown. It's rough when you get that very large trunk, but generally what you'll find is it's fairly smooth for the most part on most of the branches. The inner bark is yellow, so if you peel the bark off and you look, you'll see yellow on the underside, and then the heartwood or middle of the stems or trunk are pink to orange. And you'll often also see that with things like Manitoba maple. If you're cutting them open, you'll see red on the inside of the trunk. Twigs are often tipped with a spine. Flowers are yellow-green in color, so they're not horribly conspicuous. They're in clusters of 2 to 6. They're 4-petaled flowers, and they have separate male and female plants. So if we had been really on the ball, we would have only planted either male plants or female plants so that we got the flowers and not the berries. Fruits are small, black, a 1/4 inch across, and containing 3 to 4 seeds each, and they're very apparent in the fall. And birds really, again, really like to consume these fruits. The leaves are dark and glossy. They don't have any hair. They're broadly oval, rounded, and pointed at the tip. And they'll have fine jagged tooth margins on them, and they stay green late into the fall after a lot of other plants have lost their leaves. Generally, we find these things right now in the South Sask River Valley in and around Saskatoon. And Wascana Park has some populations that are actually originally intentionally planted, and then there's this bunch of escapes around the parkland around the legislature as well. So it is here in the province, and something that we should kind of keep an eye out for, particularly along the river valleys in the province. This plant here, garlic mustard, we don't have any record of it in Saskatchewan yet. Where we have heard of it being is in the Edmonton area. So it's around, but not necessarily in the province yet. It's what is it? It's a perennial mustard, member of the mustard family. And it has a very distinctive garlic odor to it, or onion odor to it. It was introduced initially as a easier to grow spicing alternative for sort of those onion or garlic-like flavors in food. The leaves, plants can germinate in the fall, and then those rosette leaves typically are the ones that are kidney-shaped. And then as the plant grows, the upper growth to it, you get more triangular shaped leaves with fairly sharp points at the ends. Not pointed in the sense that it has a spine, but just that the lobe at the end is very strongly pointed. And then it also has coarsely toothed margins to it. The flowers are white, and as with other mustards, they have 4 petals. They're generally found in the axils of the leaves, and as with other mustards, they tend to continue to grow that stem indeterminately into the rest of the year. As I said, it's got that kind of onion-like flower or odor to it. It generally likes to grow in the shade under trees and in wet, swampy areas. So again, river valleys, sloughs, things like that are places where are the most likely places to find it. Red Barzia, another plant that we haven't got any record of it being introduced yet to the province, but it is on our eastern borders in Manitoba. And it's not a horribly huge plant, but it's a fairly pernicious plant. It only gets to be about 1 to 2 feet tall. The stems are erect and branched. The leaves are clasping and narrow and tapered to a point. They're only about 1 1/4 inches long and borne in pairs on the stem, or opposite. The flowers are in spike-like clusters, developing in the leaf axils or at the terminal end of the plant. The blossoms are a reddish purple color, so that's that magenta type of color, and they look like a little snapdragon flower. They're generally less than a half an inch long. Generally what you'll see is that if there's an infestation, the field will look like a reddish tinge to it, in whether it's in a hayfield or a ditch, and it tends to get around in hay bales. You get about 1,400 seeds per plant, and it's got a very high dormancy rate, so once seeds are introduced and you've got seed production going on, it's pretty tough to get rid of. And there are coarse hairs all over the plant, and that allows, and hairs on the seeds as well, that allows them to stick to clothing and equipment. One of the things about this plant is that it's referred to as a Hemi Parasite, in that it grows as an independent plant early in the year, and then what it'll do is it'll latch on to the roots of grass plants and essentially pirate those roots for its own growth. And typically what happens is that occurs right around when the hay gets cut in the year. And so you've got surplus root capacity for the grass, and this plant latches onto those roots and co-ops them for its own growth. Perennial pepperweed, we don't have any record of that in the province at this point. It looks very similar to horseradish in many ways. The real distinction between it and horseradish is that when you look at the seed pods at the top of the plant, with horseradish, the division in the pod runs parallel to the widest part of the plant, whereas with perennial pepperweed, it cuts that broadest part of the pod in half. And so that's what we look for to distinguish it from horseradish. Generally, it gets up to about 1 meter tall. It's got creeping roots to it. It's a member of the mustard family. The leaves are long and narrow. They're waxy with distinctive white midveins. Then they don't clasp the stem, so that's something to specifically look for. As with other mustards, they've got 4 petals. The flowers are white, and they're borne in dense round clusters at the tip of branches. Seeds we won't get into too much, but poison hemlock. It's a biennial member of the carrot family, sometimes as a short-lived perennial. It can grow up to 8 feet tall, and it only reproduces by seed, so essentially it means that it doesn't have any creeping root component to it. It is highly poisonous for all parts of the plant, so be very careful when you're working around this plant, and a reminder to Rick Hobbs not to taste it anymore. Stems are thick, they're hollow, they've got ridges on them, and they've got deep purple spots on them, and that's one of the ways that you can distinguish it from other members of the carrot family that have white flowers, in that when you have purple spots, that's something that signals that you want to be careful around that plant, and it can be poisonous. It's got a thick white taproot that again would resemble a carrot or a parsnip. The leaves are shiny. They're 3 to 4 times divided, very much like a carrot leaf, but they're distinctive from a carrot leaf in the sense that they are shiny on the upper surface. If you injure the plant, it has a foul odor, similar to the European buckthorn. No, European. Anyway, never mind. Flowers are small and white, and they're borne in umbrella-shaped clusters, about 3 inches across at the top of the plant. Reproduces only from seed. Seeds are ridged and flattened, and generally you have 2 seeds borne together on the plant. You can mistake it for wild parsnips, except for the plants that you generate with parsnip. We'll get into that as we get going. The parsnips have yellow flowers rather than white flowers. The habitat, generally on dry to moist soils and can even tolerate poorly drained soils. So you can pretty much find it anywhere, and they will gradually invade a perennial crop. Hound's tongue is a biennial, taprooted biennial that gets up to about 1 meter tall. The leaves are soft and hairy in the rosette form, and the leaves that are produced the first year resemble the shape of a dog's tongue, so that they're broad and long, and have that hairy surface to them. Stem leaves are somewhat shorter, and they have no stalks to them. The flowers are a dull reddish color and reddish purple color. Seeds are fairly distinctive in that they're 4 rounded triangular nutlets. Because this plant is a member of the borage family, they're referred to as nutlets. And those nutlets are covered with short hooked spines, and that's what you can see in that bottom left-hand picture there. And that allows those seeds to stick to livestock and wildlife, as you can see in the top right-hand corner. And then the bottom right-hand picture is a picture of the rosette, where you've got those long, narrow-shaped leaves to them. It's also a toxic plant that can cause problems in livestock. Another woody plant, salt cedar. Salt cedar is a broadleaf shrub or small tree. It's got reddish brown or dark brown to deep purple bark to it. And it has small scaly leaves that turn yellow-orange in the fall. So that plant at the top there, that's its fall coloration. And those small scaly leaves, it's not a true cedar, but those small scaly leaves make it look like a cedar. It has white to pink flowers that are born in these large clusters, and they have 4 to 5 petals. They range anywhere from white to pink. Produces large numbers of small seeds, and it can also reproduce from buried stems. So if you see shoots coming up, you can get a handle on the identification that way as well. It's very tolerant of saline soils, and it also actually creates saline soils by concentrating salt in its leaves and then dropping those leaves on the surface, and it uses that to displace other vegetation so that it can grow effectively. Generally, it likes to grow along riparian areas or areas where there's plenty of water to tap into. This plant can use up to 300 gallons, like one of those mature trees can use up to 300 gallons of water per day. We do have records of it in the Findlater area. There's also a record of it now in the Bethune sewage lagoon, and also a dugout south of Swift Current. Jointed goat grass. It's a winter annual grass that has a similar habitat to the annual bromes. So it can grow in either pasture or winter cereals typically. It looks very similar to a wheat plant, and so that right-hand picture there is jointed goat grass next to wheat. And so the way that you distinguish it from wheat is that it's got those fine, evenly spaced hairs on the edges of the leaves, whereas wheat doesn't have those hairs. Okay, we talked about that. The seed head is a long cylindrical spike, and that's in the left-hand picture there, where you've got the seeds essentially stacked one on top of the other, and that you can get a broad range of variations from a regular wheat head to that jointed goat grass seed head on the left, where you get hybrids and variations of the two. Jointed goat grass is a member of the wheat family. It's one of the ancient wheats. Some of it is used in breeding of domestic wheat, and as a result, it shares some of the genetics of some of our domestic wheat varieties, and it can actually cross with wheat. It's well adapted to reduce tillage, but being a winter annual plant, it is susceptible to getting taken out with our annual agronomy. So that's the nice thing, that we really don't have any records of it growing in Saskatchewan at this point. There were some rumors of it, of shipments coming from or through Saskatchewan, possibly from the northern U.S. and through Saskatchewan to Thunder Bay, that went to Mexico, and it got picked up there. There's no registered controls in winter wheats here in Canada at this point. The IMIs do have some promise. They are registered in the U.S., but the challenge is that they put that resistance trait in the wheat in the same genome that domestic wheat shares with the jointed goatgrass. So that meant that a lot of the jointed goatgrass is now resistant to group 2 herbicides. And in Saskatchewan, essentially, it can be managed in the spring burn-off before seeding our annual crops. Puncture vine is a plant that the herb and spice industry had attempted to grow at one point and stopped growing it because they felt it was too aggressive and too invasive. And so that says a lot, in the sense, from the perspective that that's not something that very often happens with the herb and spice industry. They can tend to tolerate a lot of invasiveness before they decide something is a problem. It's an annual plant that lays low to the ground, and so it creates dense mats. It looks very similar to silverweed, or you'll often see similar plants that grow along the sides of the roads in the province here. Potentilla is the other one that, or cinquefoil is the other one that this kind of resembles to some degree. The leaves are hairy. They grow in pairs along the stem. You can see that in the bottom picture there. And they're also compound leaves that are divided into 4 to 8 pairs of leaflets. The flowers are yellow and 5-petaled, borne in the axils of the leaves. And the fruit has 5 sections that form sharp points, and those things can penetrate leather, rubber, tires, skin, etc. So it can be fairly problematic that way. We don't have any records of this growing in the wild at this point, but again, because it resembles some of those potentillas that grow along the sides of the road, it may be something that we're ignoring. So it might be worthwhile, when you see those things growing with yellow flowers at the side of the road, to kind of stop and have a look and see what you got there. Giant foxtail, we don't have any records of having that in Saskatchewan at this point, and essentially, in accordance with the name, it can get up to 5 feet tall. One of the key identification features when you compare it to green foxtail or wild millet is that seed head, when it's mature, tends to flop over with that sort of droopy appearance, whereas green foxtail tends not to droop over like that. The leaves can be up to 16 inches long and about 1 inch wide, so it's essentially just a larger version of green foxtail. Auricles, or the arms that are on the base of the leaf, are absent, and there is a hairy ligule where the hairs can be up to 3 millimeters in length, and it's a fairly dense hairy ligule there. And that's in the top right hand corner picture there. The seed head, late summer to early fall, it's very bristly, and it looks like green fox or wild millet, and the seed head cylindrical, bristly, and that droops with maturity. And generally it's a much larger plant than green foxtail, and has that that droopy head to it. Pelagiton, it's an annual that reproduces by seed alone. It also has a nickname called salt lover, so you'll often see it in salty areas where not much else will grow. The stems tend to be erect, so they stand up in the air 3 to 15 inches tall. The plants can be blue-green color in the spring, turning yellow or red in the fall. These are toxic to livestock, especially sheep, and that's because of the high oxalate content, and that's a problem for kidney stones, and that's where you get the toxicity coming into play. The leaves are alternate in bunches along the stem, and they're fleshy tube-like leaves that are blunt on the end and tipped with a little needle-like spine. And where it attaches, there's cottony hairs. The flowers are green and inconspicuous, so it's not something that's really going to stand out for you. And you've got dormant seeds and non-dormant seeds, which allow this plant to persist in an area for a fair period of time. Flowering rush, this is kind of an aquatic or semi-aquatic weed, and it's introduced as an ornamental plant for water gardens. Reproduces by bulblets that are formed on the roots and as well as seeds. Both of those move on water and in currents. Right now we have a few populations in the province. There's one in the west side of the province along the South Saskatchewan River. There's another one in by one of the potash mines in the east central part of the province. Hopefully that one will get under control so that it doesn't enter into the Capel River system and head into Manitoba. Stems are 3 feet tall and triangular, as with other rushes. The seeds are long-lived, and then that's one of the problems with the plant. Flowers are born in an umbrella-shaped with 3 showy white or pale pink petals per flower. And then the last one for the prohibited weeds is Dalmatian toadflax. And Dalmatian toadflax is a clump-forming perennial. Has a really stout taproot, as you can see in the bottom corner there. That plant had a diameter of about an inch in diameter of the root right there at the base of the plant. And then it also produces short creeping roots that allow it to spread out from that original plant. Leaves are hairless, waxy, and heart-shaped, and you see that in the other bottom picture there, up to about 2 inches long, and they clasp the stem. The flowers are snapdragon-like with an orange throat and bright yellow petals and a basal spur. And when we talk about this, the mirror symmetry, that means that they're symmetrical from left to right, but not up and down. And if we want to, there's another plant, evening primrose is something that often gets confused with the toadflaxes. Keep in mind, because it also has a spur at the base of the flower. But something to keep in mind with that is that the evening primrose will have 4-way symmetry. So it has 4 petals coming from the center, and then that spur goes down to the bottom. The stems are hairless, branched up to about 3 feet tall, and about 20 stems per crown or plant. So getting into the noxious weeds, we'll jump right into yellow toadflax, so we can compare that right away with Dalmatian toadflax. It's a patch-forming perennial with deep taproots and moderately creeping roots, so it makes a little bit wider patch like formation than you'll get with Dalmatian toadflax. Something more akin to Canada thistle patch. The leaves are very narrow and taper at both ends, and they're stalkless, so they'll attach directly to the stem, and you can see that in that picture on the right-hand side. The flowers, again, are snapdragon-like, so very similar to the Dalmatian toadflax flowers. except for the coloration. And the distinction here is that yellow toadflax will have a deep yellow throat rather than orange, and it'll have pale yellow petals instead of bright yellow petals that you find on Dalmatian toadflax. And it also has that basal spur as well, and the mirror symmetry. And the stems get up to about 2 feet tall, whereas with Dalmatian toadflax, it can get up to 3.5 feet tall. And so that's another way that you can distinguish the plants, is that when you have a mature plant that's flowering, the yellow toadflax will be generally somewhat shorter than Dalmatian toadflax. Yellow toadflax also has that creeping root, and that's something you can see there on the left-hand side. Russian knapweed, if we talk about that in comparison to our other two knapweeds, or three knapweeds we've already talked about. Russian knapweed is a deep-rooted, persistent perennial plant that does have lateral roots to it that they're stout, dark taproot, almost woody, and it's got moderately creeping lateral roots, and essentially what it does is form very dense colonies where it grows. The entire plant is covered with a fine hair, gray-green in appearance. The stem does branch as you get up to the top of the plant in particular. Leaves, the lower ones are shallowly lobed. So they kind of look like a Canada thistle leaf without spines on it. They're stalkless, so they attach directly to the bottom of the plant, and the leaves are alternate, arranged on the stem. The upper leaves are smaller, they're not lobed, and they have a soft spine at the tip of the leaf. The flowers are pale pink to purple. And these fade in color with age. They form at the ends of the branches. And again, we refer to the scales, scale-like bracts that are on the flower buds. Again, very similar size, the flower buds, to the other two knapweeds, or three knapweeds that we talked about. They're greenish colored bud. Their bracts are more of a green color than a gray color on the other two. And then at the tip, rather than hairs or spines, you've got a very translucent membrane-ish type of structure. And so that makes the bud appear more of a lighter whitish color. Field bindweed, another deep-rooted, persistent perennial weed that has tap roots that go down very deep into the soil with enough energy remaining in them. If you remove all the top growth and keep that plant free of top growth for 2 to 3 years, that plant can still grow back from the roots. It also has long lateral roots that it allows to produce colonies, and you can see that run along the side of the road there. That infestation there is largely being created by the grader dragging those roots along the side of the road and then reestablishing along that road edge. Stems are horizontal, or they twine up vertical structures. They have no support of their own, or no structure of their own, so they just lay flat to the ground or twine. And when they twine around things, they turn counterclockwise. And that's the opposite of what you get with wild buckwheat. And wild buckwheat turns clockwise around the plant. So that's another good way to distinguish it from wild buckwheat. The leaves are alternate, entire. So what entire means is that there's no lobes, that it's a very undisturbed edge on the leaf edge. These leaves are stalked and a narrow arrow shape, essentially, with a blunt rounded tip. It does have basal lobes where the leaf body meets its stalk, And they generally either flare outward or straight back. And again, in comparison to wild buckwheat, the lobes on wild buckwheat will typically curve inward towards that stalk. Flowers are bell or trumpet shaped. They're white to pink in color, and they're only 1 inch across. And that's in comparison to a native plant that's called hedge bindweed. Hedge bindweed has flowers that are very similar to field bindweed, except for they are kind of an ivory color, and they're up to 3 inches across. So the ones on field bindweed are born on a long flower stalk, and they're right equidistant between the top and bottom of the that stalk that the flower is born on. There'll be a small pair of leaves that are along that stalk, and that's something that hedge bindweed does not have. So that's another way to distinguish between the two. Bull thistle is a biennial. So essentially what that means is it grows as a rosette in year 1, and then it produces flowers and seeds in year 2, and then dies. So it's only alive for 2 years and then relies on seed production to reproduce. Rosettes of bull thistle can be very large. They can be up to 5 feet across, and they tend to be very hairy and very spiny. Year 2, it'll produce aerial branches that are upright, and then also produce vase-shaped flowers, so similar kind of egg-shaped or vase-shape as things like the knapweeds and other thistles, with purple-pink tops, very similar to Canada thistle, and long spines on the end of the bracts of the bud. So it's a very nasty-looking flower bud. Has a long fleshy taproot, and that's how it survives from 1 year to the next. It stores all its energy in there for the first year and then uses all the energy up in the second year of growth. Usually you find bull thistle in undisturbed areas like pastures and roadsides and waste areas. The leaves are, it can reach up to 2 meters tall. Generally it's in and around that 4 feet tall is what you'll see it. The stem has spiny wings, similar to what we talked about with the yellow star thistle earlier. That are extensions of the leaves, so you'll get the wavy spines going down the stems from where the leaves attach. The lobes of the leaves are irregular and are tipped with long yellow spines, and that's how you can distinguish it from Canada thistle. There are very stiff, coarse hairs all over the entire plant. It has much more deeply lobed leaves than Canada thistle has as well, and they're a more regular lobe. If we compare that to nodding thistle, and there is a lot of confusion between nodding thistle and bull thistle, and the two get mixed up from time to time. Again, it is a biennial plant, so it does the same thing. It grows as a rosette the first year and then flowers and dies in year 2. It also can have a really large rosette, so up to 5 feet across, but the difference between that rosette and the bull thistle rosette is that the nodding thistle rosette, the leaf surface has next to no hair or no hair at all. In year 2, a nodding thistle can grow up to 7 feet tall, produces a lot of branches with large purple-pink flowers that can get up to about 2 inches across. And that's in contrast to bull thistle, where it's got that larger vase-shaped bud, whereas nodding thistle or musk thistle, it has a more sunflower-shaped flower that's very large and pink. The leaves, similarly, they have that fringe that goes down the stem where below where the leaf meets the stem, and generally you can identify them because they're fringed with a white or pink halo on the outer edge of the leaf. So and again, they're hairless as well. Has a long fleshy taproot, and the flower, once it's out in full, it'll droop off to one side, and that hence the term nodding thistle. One thing to mention here is that we have a very effective biocontrol agent for nodding thistle, which essentially, if you've got the odd plant here and there across the landscape, you've got insects there that are working very well. Whereas if you have no insects, this plant will be a solid mat of plants all the way across the landscape. So this insect works very well, and once it's present, it manages nodding thistle very, very well. And I think it also will cross over into things like bowl thistle and Canada thistle from time to time as well. And that's one of the challenges, is that if we were to screen for this insect, again, it probably wouldn't make the cut as far as being specific enough to nodding thistle. But I encourage people to make use of this biocontrol agent. It'll save you a lot of money in the long run. Dame's Rocket. It's a biennial to short-lived perennial member of the mustard family, and it only reproduces by seed production. The roots are shallow and fibrous, so it doesn't dominate the landscape that way. It's just a very aggressive mustard member of the mustard family, and gets off to an early start, and that's how it dominates areas. The stems are erect, they're hairy, and very leafy. Mostly unbranched until you get up into that flowering raceme, and less hair near the top of the plant, and they can get up to 4 feet tall. Leaves are elongated triangles. They're alternate on the stem with a mix of simple and forked hairs on their surface. So that gives it a slightly grayish appearance in some cases as well. The edges of those leaves are slightly wavy. They have wee small maybe points or serrations on them, but very few. It's not like you're looking at something that looks like a sawtooth. You'll have the odd tooth sticking out here once in a while. The flowers are magenta to purple, and in some cases there have been varieties that have been bred to be like a whitish color as well, or a very, very pale purple. They're born in clusters at the top of the plant and in the axils of the leaves, very much similar to other mustards. And they have a very sweet odor, particularly in the evening. Wild parsnip is a member of the carrot family. So that's based on the umbrella-shaped flowers that they have. It's referred to as a monocarpic perennial. So essentially it grows as a rosette for as long as it needs to in order to get enough energy to produce a flowering stalk, and then once it produces that flowering stalk, it dies. It doesn't produce flowers more than once per plant. So, but it may take multiple years to get enough energy in the root to produce a flower. It can grow up to I will recant this 5 feet, because I've seen flowers, or I've seen plants growing up as high as 6, maybe 7 feet in really good areas. The stems are hollow and deeply grooved. It has large fleshy taproot, resembling a domestic parsnip. Surprise, surprise, this is the ancestor of our domestic parsnip. The plant is generally a color of a palish kind of green color. It reproduces only by seed. Flowers are born in umbrella-shaped structures at the top of the plants and at the ends of branches. And wild parsnip and dill are the only 2 members of the carrot family with yellow flowers, and so that's a key identifying feature of this. So if you've got something that looks like a carrot and has yellow flowers, you've either got dill, which has really lacy leaves, or you've got wild parsnip that has fairly substantial leaves to it. Seeds survive in the soil for a period of time. Let's see here. The leaves are what's referred to as pinnately compound. So essentially that means that the leaflets are borne opposite to one another along a central vein. And it has, prior to the formation of those leaflets, it has a long petiole or leaf stalk that when it meets the stem, it encircles the stem, particularly lower on the plant. Leaves have 2 to 5 leaflets that are roughly shaped like mittens, so it has one serration on one side of the leaflet. And the other thing to keep in mind, it has a diamond-shaped terminal leaflet. The other thing to be careful is with this plant, it does grow in many open areas, and it's somewhat dedicated to edge environments, kind of similar to Scentless Chamomile in some ways. But the sap of this plant can cause severe photosensitivity that can result in severe burns. So be very careful around this plant. If you do get sap on you, protect your skin from exposure to the sun and wash the sap off as fast as you possibly can. You would require soap and water to do that because it's an oil-based sap and that's the compound that causes the burning is oil-based. If you get into this stuff, the burning symptoms can persist for months because it's hard to get that stuff back out of your skin once it's in it. And so you would have to keep your skin covered up for potentially a year or two to make sure you don't get burns or blisters. Leafy Spurge, everybody's weed they love to hate. Deep-rooted, persistent perennial plant with milky sap, and that's one of the key identifying features of leafy spurge is that milky sap. The root can get up to 23 feet deep in the soil, straight down. Lateral roots up to 10 feet in all directions, and if you dig around the crown, you'll see the pink buds that will result in new plants the following year. Stems are hairless. They're unbranched except for at the top, and these plants grow up to about 3 feet tall when they're in good shape. Leaves are long and thin and entire, and as we said, that means straight edges and attached directly to the stem. The flowers are yellow to a yellowish green, and essentially the color component of that flower is actually a modified leaf or bract that sits behind the actual flower. So if we look at the little flower in the bottom left-hand corner there, those dots in the center of the color are actually the flowers. They're a 3-lobed flower, and then once they produce seed, they'll spit those seeds up to 20 feet from the parent plant. Flowers will start to appear shortly after the plant emerges in May and June. So it's one of the first plants to turn yellow in the growing season. And so that's another way to identify it and pick it out in the landscape. Would have been helpful if I had those pictures up earlier. Jorge Alyssum is an annual to short-lived perennial in the mustard family, and it's not a very tall plant, only grows about 2.5 feet tall. The whole plant is covered with star-shaped hairs. The leaves are largely in the rosette at the base of the plant, and then you have very, very small leaves that grow up in the top portion of the plant, but generally the top portion of the plant is all flowers and seed pods. The flowers are white with deeply notched petals, four petals according to the mustard rule. But these things are notched so deeply that they appear as 8 petals, and that's that top left-hand picture there. The fruits are oval seed pods, and they're 5 to 8 millimeters long, so they're not very big. They're flattened and held close to the stem, and there'll be a beak on the tip of that pod as well. And I did a little bit of mathematics with one of these plants one day and estimated that it can produce up to about 100,000 seeds per plant. Common tansy is a long-lived clump-forming perennial, reproducing only by seed. Occasionally, if you split the root, you can reproduce another plant that way, but generally it's reproduces only by seed. The roots are large and stout perennial crown with short lateral roots that expand the crown maybe a couple of inches each year. The stem, they have many stems coming from the crown. They're largely unbranched, and again, until you get up into that flowering area. And they're somewhat woody, actually. The leaves are deeply divided with deep coarse serrations on those divisions. And if you look on the underside of the leaf, you can see that there's glands on those leaves. So you can see where they'll produce some essential oils from the base of that plant. And that's one of the reasons why the plant was introduced to North America in the first place. The flowers are button-like, and so they're essentially daisy-like flowers with insignificant petals is essentially what they are. So that yellow button is essentially the button you would see in the middle of a daisy-like flower without the white petals around the outside. Absinthe is a long-lived perennial plant, again with a crown, reproduces only by seed. It has a strong sagey odor and a bitter taste. Usually produces several stems, so anywhere from 4 to 10 stems that are 2 to 4 feet tall each year. It has fine hairs over the entire plant that gives it that ghostly gray blue-green color in appearance, and paler than most of the other ones that we've talked about so far. So it gets very, very gray and almost a white color. Leaves are 2 to 4 inches across and divided several times, so you end up with these very, they have lots of lobes on these leaves, and the lobes have lobes, etc. Flowers are wind pollinated rather than being insect pollinated. They're produced in large numbers at the top of the plant, borne in spike-like panicles. The individual heads contain about 20 seeds, so each one of those little yellow balls there would contain about 20 seeds, and it can produce about 9,000 seeds per year per plant. Seed is very small, it's less than 1/16 of an inch long, shaped like a small light bulb, and the seed is short-lived, only about 4 years in the soil. So if you can control these plants in an area for 4 years, you've pretty much got it licked. And seeds germinate all year long and over a wide range of temperatures. So anywhere from early spring to late fall and anywhere in between. Scentless Chamomile is an annual, winter annual, biennial, or short-lived perennial plant. And essentially short-lived perennial, again, the biennial plant happens to survive for another year. So the perennial plants are not entirely common. Most common to be a winter annual or biennial plant. Reproduces only by seed and can produce up to 1 million seeds per very large plant or 1 million seeds per square meter of infested area. Likes moist conditions occasionally disturbed environments. So not something that's perpetually disturbed or not something that's in permanent cover. It tends to grow where that permanent cover gets disturbed. And it can cause significant seed losses, particularly in wet years. It tends to form kind of an edge habit where you can see it along the edges of fields where the disturbance on the inside of the field takes care of it and the perennial growth on the outside of it takes care of it. But where you have that disturbance, and so that line in that picture in the south and the bottom part of the frame, the line right beside the fence, that's where either a gas line or a power line or something got plowed in there, and there was a little bit of disturbance to that existing perennial cover. But you can see the rest of the perennial cover has very few plants in it, and so that's one of the ways to manage it well. Flowers are white-petaled daisy-like flowers, and generally they're smaller than a typical daisy, though. They're finely divided. They have finely divided leaves, almost like dill. They're hairless. Has a short taproot with fibrous secondary roots. Pulls out easily by hand, so it's not very strongly anchored. If we want to contrast that with Oxeye Daisy, Oxeye Daisy is a perennial with short creeping roots, and you can kind of see in the bottom there's one creeping root sticking out on the bottom left of that rosette there. The leaves, the rosette leaves are spoon-shaped. They're not divided at all like Scentless Chamomile, with scalloped edges. So rather than serrations where you've got points to them, they have rounded scallops that go around the leaf edges on the rosette. The stem, though, they're not very thick. There's not very many leaves along the stem. They're elongated leaves with coarse serrated edges, and they're attached directly to the stalk. So they're directly to the stem, so there's no petiole or leaf stalk. The flower is white petals and a yellow button, borne at the end, right at the very end of the stalk. And that's what we have today. If we have any questions, I can entertain them.
Okay, I don't see any questions. I'm just gonna go over a few little things, so I'm gonna take back control here, Clark.
Okay.
It's just taking a minute to load here. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm gonna go through this fairly quickly, but I should have gone over this right off the start, but just to remind everybody about our 3 types of weeds under the Saskatchewan Weed Control Act. Clark went over, he started with the prohibited weeds and moved on to the noxious weeds. We're not going to bother covering nuisance weeds because if you don't know what a dandelion looks like, you probably should not be a weed inspector. So good reference materials that we tend to use a lot in the field. I had shown this, I think, in our last webinar, but this first Weeds of Canada book is no longer in print, but you might be able to find the odd copy here and there. It's my personal favorite, but this next one, Weeds of North America, is by the same authors, and it's got a lot of the same information, but it's just a little thicker and it's got more weeds in it. These are also very good. This invasive plant species identification guide, this is a really good little pocket guide to have in your truck or in your field kit. They're free, and you just have to find them wherever they're available. Another one is Weeds of the Prairies. This is a really good one for beginners, and it's got a pretty good selection of weeds in there, just maybe not as extensive as the one on the previous page.
Katie, just a quick comment that I believe that the Saskatchewan Invasive Species Council is planning to do another edition of that small pocket guide.
Right.
And so there'll probably be a few more additional weeds in it, and then they'll do another reprint.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I just wanted to look at a few common lookalikes, just because we do get a lot of questions about them, and as soon as certain ones start blooming, we know pretty much exactly what people are talking about. So a really common native plant is fireweed, and it gets confused with purple loosestrife a lot. Purple loosestrife tends to have just this long sort of spike of flowers, and it occurs in more clumps along marshy areas, wetlands, that kind of thing. And fireweed, you can find it. I see it a lot in forested areas or pastures or kind of native fields. You can see how the flowers are kind of away from the stem, and they're bigger and kind of more noticeable. The leaf arrangement is also a little bit different. Purple loosestrife has opposite leaves, whereas fireweed has alternate leaves. And purple loosestrife, the big one to notice on this one is that it has a square stem. So if you split the stem, it'll look like a square.
Just a quick note there too is that it may have more than 4 sides to it, the
Okay,
purple loosestrife. Yeah, it still has the angles, but it may have more than 4 sides.
right. Good to know. Okay, the next one, Clark talked about this, so I won't go over it in very great detail, but I just thought this bottom picture was really neat to show how the leaves are shaped. Also, if you look at the plant structure itself, you can see that the oxeye daisy has just one long stem, and the scentless chamomile has lots of branches coming off of that main stem. I hear a lot about these ones as well. I hear a lot of people just calling Absinthe Sage, and it is not sage. It's got all these finely divided leaves. I want to call it like fern-like almost. And the growth habit too. It's got this more of a clustery shape to it. A lot of times you can see the old skeletons from last year, like this top picture on the top left would be kind of an overwintered one, and you can often see the old stems coming right out of that rosette. It can grow to be quite tall as well, whereas the pasture and prairie sage don't get nearly as tall. And you'll notice the leaf shape on the sage as well is that more of a flat leaf shape, and it doesn't have the same divisions that the absinthe would. I got this one a couple years ago. I had a counselor ask me about it, and well, he was a weed inspector as well, but he sent me these pictures, and it's got the yellow flowers on it, and he thought it was wild parsnip, and it actually is not. It's called heart-leaved Alexanders, and it's a native plant. When I look at wild parsnip, I like to think of the leaves as being like celery leaves. I know Clark calls them mitten shaped, but sometimes they're not always in that mitten shape. They just remind me a lot of celery. So if that helps you identify it, then hopefully it does. And then the heart-leaved Alexanders, you can see the little tooth-shaped leaves, or the leaves with the toothed edges, and they're a lot more rounded in shape, and the leaves are a little bit thicker, as well as the flower shape is a little bit different, and they're also shorter than wild parsnip. And that's all I had. I see that we're well over time, but if anyone has any questions, I'll just check and see if there's any. Oh, Fireweed and Dame's Rocket. Yeah. Clark, do you want to talk about that one?
I think what you'll find with between Fireweed and Dame's Rocket is that Fireweed will droop, like the flowers will droop more than they will on Dame's Rocket. Fireweed tends to be more of a pink color as well, whereas Dame's Rocket is more towards that purple spectrum, purple color side of things. The flowers are much tighter with Dame's Rocket as well, so
Does Fireweed
it's quite obvious when you look at Dame's Rocket that it's a mustard, and typically with fire. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Clark. I was just going to ask, does Fireweed have a smell?
Go ahead,
I
Kate.
don't think it does. Oh.
I'm not entirely sure.
Oh, because I know Dame's Rocket.
I haven't stopped to smell the flowers, so to speak.
Dame's Rocket will have quite a strong smell, really sweet.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's largely because it's been grown as an ornamental for many generations, so so it's been bred to have a strong smell.
Okay.
Looks like we got some chat going on, so that's good.
Yeah.
Do you want to answer Crystal's question there?
Oh, yes. There will be the copy of the presentation itself, and the PowerPoint will be available on the same website. After it's posted, I can send out the link to everybody.
Rick had a question about biocontrol. Which biocontrol are you talking about, Rick?
Tansy.
For Tansy, there's nothing for common Tansy yet that I'm aware of. It is being worked on. It's been introduced to Western Chamomile, Western Canada already, to the Lethbridge Research Containment Center for them to work on it there and to make sure that it gets cleaned of any parasites that it might be carrying. So it may be there, but it hasn't been introduced to the field yet. Scentless Chamomile, the agents that we have on that have been around for quite a while now. The last one that was introduced was the gall midge back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So that's the last one that was introduced in Scentless Chamomile. Talk to your local Rick. Talk to your local PHO, and then they can set something up to get agents. You may want to actually check your Scentless Chamomile areas to see if those agents aren't actually there already.
Yeah,
Ryan had a question about it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's something we can definitely work with him on to see if he already does have the agents for Scentless.
Yeah. If you've got the gall agents, or like the Scentless Chamomile gall midges, those spread very quickly and very widely from where they've been introduced. And just because you've introduced biocontrol agents doesn't mean that the weed is not going to grow anymore. So just keep in mind that biocontrol agents are not herbicides. So it's not that you get 99.99% control once you introduce a biocontrol agent into a system. Essentially what it means is that you don't get those essentially dominant over the entire landscape populations like you would have before the agent was introduced. What the role of the biocontrol agent is that you are at a point where you're essentially pulling your hair out from the weed. You've got very few economical options left, and so the biocontrol is an option of last resort. If you've got the odd plant here or there, you're not in a position to introduce a biocontrol agent. 6-foot tall weed that looks like wild parsnip that grows in pasture here, possibly wild parsnip. Get it, take a sample of it. If you're a weed inspector, you can you've got a bunch of different options. You can utilize the expertise of the plant health officers. You can utilize the expertise of our regional specialists at the Saskatchewan Agriculture Regional Offices, or as a weed inspector, you have service available to you at the Crop Protection Lab in Regina to have it ID'd, and the normal fee that gets charged for anybody else on that is waived to weed inspectors. So that's one way to get it identified. The best way to get a plant identified is not in the end of May or early June, unless it's leafy spurge. What you want to do is make sure that plant gets into the flowering stage before you send it in, and that's the best time to identify plants, because then you've got all those structures there and you can key it out right down to the species. If you don't have all the structures there, then you're essentially you're flying a guess. You're wagging a flag essentially. So we want to make sure that we get all those structures there and get it ID properly.
Perfect. It looks like that's all the questions we have for now. And being that it is almost 1:30, I think we're going to call this a wrap for today. Thanks so much, Clark, for all the information. I hope everybody got something out of it today. And thanks everyone for attending all these webinars. We really appreciate it. And we hope that you all found them valuable, and stay tuned for more details on more webinars for next winter. As always, if you have any questions about weeds or biocontrol, weed ID, that kind of thing, feel free to contact your local plant health officer. We are here to help, and we like to get out in the field. So yeah, thank you so much, and have a fantastic day, everyone.